We would like to acknowledge the indigenous and the cultures of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, and that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their cultures and by learning the truth of their history and how it provided the foundation for this country as we experience it today. Very, very important. And we thank you for that time to share with us the land acknowledgement. So we have our Learning Cafe speaker for today, first one of the year. Her name is Sam Fletcher. I'm gonna give you a little bit of her background before she meets with all of you and she presents her content. Since entering the field of social work, Samantha, Sam Fletcher, Ph.D., has served in a variety of positions. She was the project coordinator and senior research assistant for the New York State PFC Joseph P. Dwyer Statewide Veteran Peer Support Program Evaluation. Then she served as the assistant dean of the academic programs in the School of Social Welfare at the University at Albany, where she worked with a diverse team to provide a quality education for social work students. Sam joined the National Association of Social Workers, New York State chapter in September 2019. Along with her colleagues and volunteers, she worked to create an inclusive chapter that is representative of social workers across the state. The team changed the chapter's advocacy structure, which is now led by NASW, New York State members, increased continuing education opportunities, transformed the Veterans Mental Health Training Initiative to train thousands of social workers in New York about military culture, created This Is Social Work Initiative, started multiple special interest groups, and developed multiple racial justice and LGBTQ plus initiatives designed to educate and transform the profession of social work. In October 2023, Sam accepted the position of Director of Workforce Development at the New York State Office of Mental Health. Sam is a member of the Cherokee Nation. She was raised on Cherokee land about an hour outside of the reservation. Sam and her husband of 26 years chose to build their family through adoption, including one child through the Indian Child Welfare Act. Without further ado, ECLC would like to present to you Sam Fletcher.
Osio, Dakwadoa Hi'a Sam Fletcher, Chi Jalagi. Hello, my name is Sam Fletcher and I am Cherokee. I do not speak my language fluently, but I have learned to introduce myself and some key phrases from our language. Today is the first part of a series that I'm doing in February as well, titled Introduction to Native Culture and History from a Cherokee Perspective. Today, I'm going to cover a brief introduction that I do whenever I do any trainings on my culture or history or anything that has to do with natives. We're going to talk about genocide, the Indian American Wars, cultural genocide, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and where our current tribes stand. It's important that I tell you as I'm starting this that, as you can see from the agenda, we're going to be talking about heavy topics. I don't typically like to do trigger warnings, but I just want to make you aware that we are going to be speaking about these things. I feel as a Native person that it's my job to talk about what my ancestors and current people endure. In order to do this, I have to compartmentalize. I can't emotionally connect to what I'm talking about, or else I wouldn't be able to do this. So I think it's important that you know that about me before I start. And the other thing I want to say before we get into it is that I have essentially about 40 to 45 minutes to talk about the history of my people over thousands of years. So we will barely be touching scratching the surface today of Native history. It is a brief look into our world. Like I said in my introduction, I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation and also of the Bird Clan within my nation. You will also hear me talk about the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation, because that's my son's tribe, who's adopted. And I will explain when we get to the Indian Child Welfare Act why he's from a different tribe. But you'll hear me talk about both tribes. I always like to talk about the diversity of Native cultures. First of all, there are differences between tribes. There are certain things that I can talk to a Native person in any tribe and they know what I'm talking about. We have a lot of cultural connection between the tribes, but we are also diverse and have differences, different practices, some different beliefs, different ceremonies, things like that. And you will also find diversity within the tribes, just like you do within any other group of people. You're hearing my perspective and what I think about and talk about when I talk about history. You could have another Cherokee person tomorrow present to you, and it would be totally different. Part of the reason why we have the different even different cultures within the tribe or different ways to connect to culture is because of the impact of cultural genocide, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit today. So you'll have more of an understanding of why that exists. The other thing I like to talk about is racial diversity. I'm sure when you saw me or saw my picture attached to this training, you're like, well, she's not Native, she's white. I hear that all the time, and I fully understand that I have white privilege. Now, I know that I do look Cherokee because my nation is incredibly racially diverse. We have the whitest white person to the blackest black person and every shade in between. But it's very important when I talk about this that my experiences are very different than darker people who are Native. My son is quite a bit darker than I am, and he faces racism all the time, and I've never faced racism. So that is a difference, that I am treated differently and have a privilege because of my skin tone. And the last thing I'd like to touch on, just because I have a lot of people ask me this, what do we call you? What name do you prefer? With Native people, we tend to introduce ourselves by our tribe. Just like I said several times already, I'm Cherokee, my son's Cheyenne and Arapaho. When you meet someone, a lot of times we'll introduce ourselves that way. But when we're talking about the collective, it really depends. I use Indian. I grew up in Oklahoma, which was Indian territory. There's 39 tribes. So it was the Indian Nation, it was the Indian Hospital, Indian Services. My son, who grew up in New York, he hates the term Indian. He never uses it. I also use Native a lot. I don't tend to use Native American because I don't think America has a lot to do with Native, at least through my perspective. And other things people will call the collective is Indigenous or First Nations. The easiest thing to do is just ask someone what they prefer and then use their terminology out of respect. Okay, now we're going to get into the deep content. In the Cherokee Nation, at least for me, I learned my history through elders. That's very common across Native communities, that our history is typically handed down by elders, told by elders, and it's typically oral as well. Now, this summer in August, I went to the Native Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been several times to D.C., but finally got the courage to go. And the reason I'm telling you this is because you're going to see pictures like the one on the screen right now that I'm going to be reading throughout this presentation. I took pictures while I was at the museum because my son wasn't with me and I wanted to share the things from the museum with him. I was so emotionally impacted by the museum. I could not share these with him until like 2 weeks ago while I was preparing for this. It took me that long to be able to talk about the museum and what is there. So this first picture from the museum that I'm going to talk about, all over the museum, they have these posters where it'll show the viewpoint of Native people and the viewpoint of Europeans and talk about the differences. For this one, I'm just wanted to focus on the Native because it really validates what I always talk about with our history being orally passed down. So it says, to Native people, oral speech was more trustworthy than written words. this is a quote from Kanekungo, who was Seneca. We have methods of transmitting from father to son an account of all these things, whereby you will find the remembrance of them faithfully preserved. So this is the tradition in our history. Now, when I learned the history of my people, I learned pre-1492 first, how our people organized, what their lifestyle was like, all about our ancestors. 1492 is the number that starts the beginning of the genocide with the Europeans landing in North America. So sometimes you'll see things from Native people where it'll say 1491, and it's just referring to the time before the Europeans came. Now, when I learned my history, I wasn't sitting and listening to elders like over a few days or something talk about it. It was over years. When we learned about how our people would transport things like in woven baskets, we would weave baskets and learn how to do that. When we would learn about the warriors in our tribe, we would go out and shoot bows and arrows. Living in Oklahoma, my brother would also look for arrows. And he would often find them because there were plenty arrowheads that were, a couple hundred years old. When we learned about beading, we would learn to bead. We would actually bead, very beautiful jewelry and different things. So everything was really hands-on. There's things about our culture that I'll talk about in February. Like, we don't have hierarchy in the same way that Europeans or Americans have hierarchy. We organize ourselves completely different. And again, there's differences within tribes. My tribe happens to be matrilineal, so you'll see a lot of very strong female representing people in charge or making decisions. Then, of course, we learn our history post-1492, which is the genocide. It's estimated that before 1492, there were between 5 and 15 million Native people that covered what is now the United States. By the end of 1800, we were down to between 238,000 and 250,000, so around 250,000 people. We were almost completely gone, and there were certain tribes that were completely gone. Everyone dead. Why? How did this happen? Well, there were a series of actions that contributed to the genocide of our people. One is that when Columbus landed and when the first Europeans landed, when you read original text, we were described as savages. We were described as animals, as inhumane. When you dehumanize a people, it's much easier to kill that people and to not respect that people. So a lot of the genocide did come from murder, torture, mutilation, things that you associate with genocide. We were also killed by diseases, and disease being used as a weapon of genocide. We learned this, I'm not sure if you all learned this, but we learned about George Washington giving blankets that had smallpox on them to the Native tribes during the war. Different ways to spread diseases that we had not built up an immunity to that killed us. Why? What are some other drivers behind this? One of the things you have to understand about Native people is our relationship to the land. And it's very difficult for me to explain this, especially not having my native language. In a lot of Native languages, there are numerous words for everything that has to do with the land and the weather and everything like that, because we are so intrinsically tied to it. As Native people, it is our responsibility to respect the land as a living being, to protect the land. When we grow in the land and we grow vegetables or we grow food, our job is to leave the land better than we found it. You grow in ways that enrich the soil, that make it healthier. everything you do is respect and living with the land. We don't believe, a lot of Native people don't believe you can own land. You're stewards of the land. You take care of the land. And that includes the animals. And a lot of Native languages, the word for animals is the same as the word for people. We highly respect the animals. For example, the Cherokee lived with the buffalo. Now, we were hunters, and there were times when we would have to kill a buffalo for food, but that was a sacred act. You never, ever kill for sport. If you have to take a life, then you respect that life by using every part and honoring that life. So therefore, when Europeans came and there was this push to own land, and I think some of that came from what they felt like they didn't get from their home countries and opportunities they didn't have there. But they almost felt like entitled to the land and what the land provided, including things like crops, being able to grow crops and sell them, what the land provided under it through minerals, things like gold, different gems, things like that was very important to the Europeans, and it didn't hold the same value. Those things don't hold the same value in Native cultures. So one of the things I remember very strongly when I was learning my history is seeing pictures of the buffalo when the Europeans came, that they would just kill the buffalo and leave the whole buffalo there. You would just see a field of dead buffalo. That is extremely distressing to us as Native people. It is so important to respect the land and the animals on the land. So as climate change is happening, as the earth is in the process of dying, essentially, this kills us, it kills our people because of our connection to the land. I'm going to show you a couple of maps. This first map shows what the United States looked like before 1492. So my people, the Cherokee, our ancestral land is in Southeast United States, and Cherokee means people of the mountains. So we're mountain people. We lived in the mountains here. And then I always show my son's people. His tribe is a combination of two tribes, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. So he comes from Plains people. So this is where his ancestral land is. And then they also moved to Colorado before they eventually were forcibly moved to Oklahoma. Now, the next map I'm going to show you, it shows a progression of essentially the genocide of our people over time. It starts at the end of the 1700s and it ends at the end of the 1800s. It actually ends with the Native tribes today, and it shows you how in that 100-year period, how strong the genocide was. Now, when I click on the map, the colored portion of the map represents Native tribes. So we're already at a part, you'll see the white part represents the European people. You'll already see where part of the genocide has happened and the removals have happened, but it'll go through the rest of those. So here we have at the beginning, 1784, and you can see every 10 years just how quickly we are gone until it ends, of course, with today. Here's what's left after covering the entire land. Next, I'm going to move on to a few points in our history that I like to talk about when I'm doing these presentations. The first is about the Indian American Wars. I'm just going to talk about a few of the battles. Now, when I do this, when I present, I hate to read. I don't like doing that. I like to just talk to you. But for this, because it's history, I'm actually going to read this part because I don't want to mess anything up. So I'm going to begin in 1622. On March 22nd, 1622, Powhatan Indians attacked and killed colonists in Eastern Virginia, known as the Jamestown Massacre. The attack gave the English government an excuse to justify their efforts to attack and kill Indians and confiscate their land. I'm also just going to highlight the revolution the Revolutionary War quickly and just say that Native tribes fought on both sides of the war. Some fought with the British, some fought with the Americans. It didn't matter which side we fought on, we lost. We were not included in any of the peace talks, and the tribes ended up losing more land after that war. Next, I just want to talk quickly about the Seminole Wars. So the Seminole, their ancestral land is in Florida, and there were 3 wars with the U.S. Army. The first war was in 1816. It lasted 2 years. The Seminole fought alongside runaway slaves. So they formed together and they fought and they won, and they were able to hold on to the land. They were attacked again in 1835 during the Second Seminole War. This war lasted 7 years, and the Seminole sustained huge casualties during this war. They managed to hold on to their ancestral land, but barely. By the time the Third War came in 1855, it lasted 3 years. That was it. The Seminole could not hold on to their ancestral land, and they were moved to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. The next war I want to talk about is my son's tribe. On November 29th, 1864, a peaceful band of Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Native Americans are massacred by Colonel John Chivington's Colorado volunteers at Sand Creek, Colorado. The causes of the Sand Creek massacre were rooted in a long conflict for control of the Great Plains of eastern Colorado. In August 1864, the governor of Colorado met with Black Kettle and several other chiefs to forge a new peace, and all parties left satisfied. Black Kettle moved his band to Fort Lyon, Colorado, where the commanding officer encouraged him to hunt near Sand Creek. In what can only be considered an act of treachery, Colonel Chivington moved his troops to the plains, and on November 29th, they attacked the Native Americans, scattering men, women, and children and hunting them down. The casualties reflect the one-sided nature of the fight. 9 of Chivington's men were killed. 148 of Black Kettle's followers were slaughtered. More than half of them women and children. The Colorado volunteers returned and killed the wounded, mutilated the bodies, and set fire to the village. After the Indian American Wars, the federal government suppressed all attempts at tribal independence. We are sovereign nations. I'm going to talk more about this in February, but I always say we're ostensibly sovereign. We're not really sovereign. And again, I'll get more into that and what that looks like in February. The next thing I like to talk about is the Declaration of Independence of 1776. This is arguably one of the founding documents of this country, and a document that's usually held in high regard. I think it's very important to understand what the Declaration of Independence has in it. When I read this quote, direct quote from the Declaration of Independence, when they say he, they are referring to the King of England. He has plundered our seas, ravished our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. I like to liken this to gaslighting in written form. After I just talked to you about the history, I showed you the map of the genocide of our people. This is written in the founding document of our country, describing us. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this section is the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This act was championed by President Andrew Jackson. You are probably not going to find a Native person who speaks highly of Andrew Jackson. In fact, a lot of Native people will not use the $20 bill because his picture is on it. Andrew Jackson signed this act, wanted this act in law, because The United States wanted access to the Southeast because of the crops that could be grown for profit, as well as gold and other things they had found on the land. This is where my tribe was, the Cherokee. It was also home to the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, the Chickasaw. The Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Chickasaw, they all ended up signing treaties and being removed to Oklahoma. They were all part of the Trail of Tears. That is probably the two lines you learned in your history book about our people, is the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was horrific for anyone that was on it. There are many tales of the women being raped, gang raped often. It usually lasted about 18 months. Our people were moved in freezing conditions. They would sometimes be forced to swim across a river in freezing conditions. For the Cherokee, we refused to leave when this act was signed. So we were forcibly removed in 1838. 16,000 of our ancestors left on this journey, and a quarter of them died along the way. Now, every year, and I put a link to this in the resources you'll receive, our tribe does a remembrance ride for our ancestors, and we have young female Cherokee who ride their bikes along the trail to pay honor to our ancestors and honor to those we lost. This is a quote from Andrew Jackson that I took again at the museum, took the picture of. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. I think it's incredibly important that we pay attention to how our leaders speak about groups of people. This happens to be my group of people, but it could just as easily be your group of people. Next, I'm going to switch gears to the cultural genocide. The cultural genocide of our people happened through boarding schools. I'm going to read this quote from the National Museum. "Kill the Indian, save the man." That was the motto of Richard Henry Pratt, the most prominent Indian educator of the late 1800s. Progressive reformers like Pratt believed it was essential to get Indian children away from their families and nations in order to prevent parents from raising the children in their own cultures. So the reformers founded boarding schools where children could be isolated from Indian languages, values, and traditions. Cultural erasure was the stated goal. The cultural genocide happened over a 150-year period, although the effects are still going on today. This was between 1819 and 1969, sorry. There were 408 government or church-run boarding schools across 37 states or territories. Now, I can talk more about this next time, but you may meet Native people who hate Christians. You will also meet Native people who are Christians. But a lot of times, if you meet someone who has very strong negative views toward Christians, a lot of times that's rooted in the boarding schools and what happened to our people there. The boarding schools were funded through the Civilian Act Fund of 1819 and the Peace Policy of 1869. And you see that horrific quote again, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Everything was about making us not who we are. Everything was to separate us from who we were meant to be and who we were. Over this 150-year time period, tens of thousands of Native children were in boarding schools. By 1926, 83% of all Native children were in boarding schools. That is over 8 in 10. Can you imagine what that does to a people to have over 8 in 10 of their children removed, taken? Now, something amazing happened in 2021. Before 2021, Justin Thoreau in Canada had started to make moves to make reparations to the Native people of Canada and what they had done to them. He had made public apologies and, very important, had put a lot of money behind efforts to make reparations to the Native people. In 2021, the Canadian government released a report showing mass graves at several of the Canadian boarding schools. What lined up, we would say the ancestors lined up at this exact time, was the first Native person to serve as a secretary in the federal government, and that's Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. And when, after this report was released in Canada, Deb Haaland announced a federal investigation in the United States of the oversight of the Native boarding schools. In 2022, the first report, the first volume of the Native schools was released. I'm going to play a video clip. We've gotten it as loud as I can get it, but I think it's very important to share it. And the link of it is also in your resources. So hopefully you can watch the whole clip. This is Deb Haaland when she announced the release of the first report. Sorry, I'm just having a little trouble. Okay.
The Indigenous people who are the original stewards of the lands where we live and work. Making them is part of acknowledging who we are and who has been here. It's about the history of the land and the people. This is the same reason that we often speak about traditional or Indigenous knowledge. My ancestors lived sustainably in the Southwest and survived famine and drought with the understanding that future generations would rely on their hard work and sacrifices. I can't help but think about the environmental tragedies that might have been avoided, like the Dust Bowl, the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and the growth of extreme wildfires across the West, if the federal government had consulted with and respected the practices of stewarding the earth that Indigenous people developed over millennia. As the federal government moved the country west, they also moved to exterminate, eradicate, and assimilate Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. The languages, cultures, religions, traditional practices, and even the history of Native communities, all of it was targeted for destruction. Nowhere is that clearer than in the legacy of federal Indian boarding schools. For more than a century, tens of thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their communities and forced into boarding schools run by the U.S. government, specifically the Department of the Interior and religious institutions. The consequences of federal Indian boarding school policies, including the intergenerational trauma caused by forced family separation and cultural eradication, which were inflicted upon generations of children as young as 4 years old, are heartbreaking and undeniable. When my maternal grandparents were only 8 years old, they were stolen from their parents' culture and communities and forced to live in boarding schools until the age of 13. Many children like them never made it back to their homes. Each of those children is a missing family member, a person who was not able to live out their purpose on this earth because they lost their lives as part of this terrible system. This is not new to us. It's not new to many of us. As Indigenous people, we have lived with the intergenerational trauma of federal Indian boarding school policies for many years. But what is new is the determination in the Biden-Harris administration to make a lasting difference in the impact of this trauma for future generations. The federal policies that attempted to wipe out Native identity, language, and culture continue to manifest in the pain tribal communities face today, including cycles of violence and abuse, disappearance of Indigenous people, premature deaths, poverty and loss of wealth, mental health disorders, and substance abuse. Recognizing the impacts of the federal Indian boarding school system cannot just be a historical reckoning. We must also chart a path forward to deal with these legacy issues. To address the intergenerational impact of federal Indian boarding schools and to promote spiritual and emotional healing in our communities, we must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past. Today, we take a critical step forward in that work.
As I transition my slides, I just want to highlight what Deb Holland said. We all knew this happened. We all knew this history. We knew that the children were physically, sexually, psychologically abused in these boarding schools. They were often tortured if they were caught using their real name, speaking their language, engaging in a ceremony, speaking with another Native person about anything that had to do with their culture or their people. The children were also exploited like other groups in America. They were part of the people who built the country without pay and supported communities by cooking, making clothing, working in construction, building the railroads, building the infrastructure. In 1 year of this investigation, 1 year of the report, they found marked and unmarked burial sites at 53 schools. Approximately 19 of these schools accounted for over 500 Indian child deaths. That was 1 year. This is barely the beginning of what they will find. I just want to, this is a picture I took at the museum, and I want to read the quote from Lone Wolf, who was Blackfoot. The soldiers came and rounded up the Blackfeet children. None of us wanted to go, and our parents didn't want to let us go. Our belongings were taken from us and set afire. Next was the long hair, the pride of all Indians. The boys would break down and cry when they saw their braids thrown on the floor. Native people, we tend to wear our hair long because we grow our hair to connect with the earth. I had long hair. You'll see a picture in a minute. Until medical things happen, I can't no longer grow my hair long, but my brother always had long hair. His child always has long hair. It is the way of our people. To forcibly cut the hair is an act of violence toward Native people. I always share this picture from the Carlisle Indian School because the look of the faces on the children is the look of trauma. You can see what has been taken from them and from their people. And just imagine all these children and the communities they left behind. In my last few minutes before we get to questions, I'm just going to cover a couple of things briefly. You've heard me talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA as we call it. ICWA is a policy that was enacted in 1978. So I just talked about the 150-year period of cultural genocide through boarding schools. What they found in the 70s at the end of the boarding schools is that Native children were being removed at an incredibly high rate from their homes by state and private agencies. Up to 25 to 35% of the Native children were being removed. And they found that this was typically because of cultural ignorance and not understanding the ways of our people. So thankfully, Congress saw that it was incredibly important for us to begin putting our lives back together after the horrible genocide and cultural genocide of our people, that Native children should be with Native families. So they created ICWA. ICWA essentially states that tribal nations supersede federal nations and local nations in issues of child custody, that every effort has to be made that children are put in Native homes. So that goes within the tribe first, and then cross-tribal if you can't find a family in the tribe, because some of our tribes are so small that it's difficult to find someone. The people who qualify for ICWA is any child enrolled in a tribe, or someone whose parent is enrolled in a tribe. They qualify for ICWA, and the ICWA policy has to be applied. Now, there have been moves to remove ICWA since it was enacted, including just in 2023. It was in the Supreme Court again. I talked to you about my son, Seth, who is an ICWA baby. So in this picture, this is me with my real hair. This is my husband and my older son, Tyler. This is Seth at 12 days old with Rachel, his birth mom, his birth grandmother, and his birth brother. Now, it wasn't an easy decision for Rachel to place her child for adoption, but it was what she felt was a necessary decision, that she didn't feel like she was capable of giving Seth what he needed. But as you can see from this picture, this is the day that she handed him over, that it was a very respectful ceremony, and that we paid a lot of honor to Rachel and her grandma and her mother and her son during this process. Where are we now? So now we make up about 2% of the population. There's about 6.8 million of us. There are 574 federal and state recognized tribes. That distinction is important. A federally recognized tribe receives funding from the government for parts of the nation, the tribal nation. There are unrecognized tribes. So I think a good example is one of the criteria to be a federally recognized tribe is that you have to have your own language. Well, I just explained the genocide and the cultural genocide. And when you have over 8 out of 10 children removed from the tribe and removed from their language, sometimes it's hard to hold the language in the tribe. In fact, it's one of the only good things about social media, in my opinion, is that it has allowed tribes to revitalize languages. And there's a huge movement across the nations to revitalize our languages. I also listed the top 10 states with the highest percentage of Native populations. So in Alaska, about 1 in 5 people is Native Alaskan. And then Oklahoma, which makes sense because it's Indian territory. There's around 39 tribes there. And then as you can see, the population declines in the next highest states going down. And then I just want to end this portion with one last photograph from the museum. We never gave up. And this whole wall in the museum is covered with Native tribes, members from multiple tribes over the generations, over the years. There are tribes who go every single year to Washington to try to force the federal government to honor the treaties. So most of the treaties are not fully honored with the tribes. So for example, in the Cherokee Nation, in our treaty, we're supposed to have a voting member of Congress. We have a member of Congress, Kim Teehee, but she's not a voting member. She can sit on committees, but she cannot vote in the interest of the Cherokee people. So that's just one example. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I've had the chat off, so I'm hoping Elijah can help me with some questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much, Sam. Before we get to the Q&A, and we thank everybody for their time and being able to offer their questions, you can still place your questions in the Q&A box that's in the bottom of your control panel where the chat and the share screen options are. So please do that if you can. But we want to offer our sincere and compassionate gratitude and support to you. We know it's not an easy thing to recount the story and journey of your people for learning and informative engagement such as this. And we saw you going through some of the dealing with and balancing the energies and the emotion as you did recount the historical facts and the story. So we thank you so much for that. And we just ask the audience to show your love, show your support, your hearts, and your hand claps for Sam. We do appreciate you. Before we get into the Q&A, we would like for everyone to pay swift attention to the chat We do have a survey link that we would like everyone to just click on and have stored in the background, because we like to take our time with the Q&A and get thorough and clear questions and answers. But once we complete our Learning Cafe for today, we'd like to receive your evaluation and your feedback so that we can get more speakers like Sam back to our Learning Cafes from month to month. So please give it a click, stay tuned, and have it all readied up by the time you leave this Learning Cafe, and we do thank you. So Sam, that was heavy. That had a lot of insight. It was profound. I learned something new. I know our audience did too. We do have a couple of questions. The first one I would like to start with would be, what is the reasoning for trying to reverse ICWA? How can we support the continuation of ICWA?
Great question. So there are several people in child welfare, adoptions, foster care that are not familiar with this policy. And so there are Native children who are placed in non-Native homes. And sometimes it doesn't come to light until they've been there, maybe a year or something, that ICWA was not applied. And so the non-Natives who want to adopt or foster these children fight hard against ICWA and the policy. So that's where a lot of the resistance comes. I suggest, if you listen to even like NPR always covers, stories, but there are different, you can, anything in the news that's about Native issues, I read. So I'm always aware of what's going on. So just last year, just with the Supreme Court, ICWA was up again. They also were deciding about water rights for the Navajo Nation, because per the treaty, the Navajo Nation has rights to the Colorado River. But, so that was in the Supreme Court. There are Indigenous issues and tribal issues in the Supreme Court all the time and in the courts all the time, because just like that slide, we never gave up. We never give up. We are constantly fighting for those treaties to be followed and to be honored the way they were written. So that's the pushback on ICWA. And I hope that and I'm glad that you support ICWA, and I hope that you understand why that policy is so important, because of what happened to our children. And like Deb Holland said, we are still living with the impact of the boarding schools. I have friends who are in boarding schools that they live in. One of my good friends' father was in a boarding school, and he refuses to speak English because of the impact of the boarding school on him. They were horrific, and what it did to our communities was horrific. So we need our children. We need them to learn our ways. We need to be passing down our history and our ways to our children.
Absolutely, and that's part of diversity equity. When we talk about equity, it's restoration, very important element. In that vein, our next question, and it reminds me of the slide that you had up that showed percentages of where are we now? Where are Native and Indigenous brothers and sisters now? What number of Cherokee peoples live in cities or urban settings compared to reservation land?
I don't have the percentages, but I'll say most. I say there's a huge amount. We call them urban Indians. We're urban Indians. But yeah, a tremendous amount of Native people are in urban communities. Reservations tend to be horrible. And I say that with full respect. We were not moved to the best. So you saw the maps, and I always say, living in Oklahoma for 30 years, they moved us to Oklahoma because it's horrible land. It's flat. I apologize that you went from Oklahoma here, but it is not a mountainous, forest-ridden land with beautiful natural water flowing through it. So a lot of the places where we are moved is not land that is healing, or is land that's been destroyed. I mean, we're going to find beauty in any land. Even I see pictures from my tribe every day, and they find the most beautiful pictures. And I'm like, you all are amazing for finding the beauty where you're at. But the reservations tend to be there. a lot of us tend to live in poverty. I grew up in immense poverty. There are, so we're sovereign nations. We're not really sovereign. There are federal things that have to happen for businesses to go onto some of the reservations. So it could take like 7 years to get a grocery store onto the reservation, or a business onto the reservation, which of course businesses are jobs. Those are jobs for our people. It's what sustains a community. So there's all of these factors kind of playing into why people leave the reservation or leave the area where their people are.
Appreciate you, Sam. And that's very, very important. Some of us that may have misconceptions of what reservation life is. And please, if you have an interest, just try to discover any literature that comes directly from Indigenous people that describes life on the reservation and outside of it. A follow-up question. Do you know if any federal agencies or organizations consult Native nations when discussing issues like climate change?
Well, if you put Native people in control of it, I always say it would be solved. Let Indigenous nations control what happens with the land. Do I think that they're consulting? I mean, I can't answer that. I am sure that happens in some capacity. Is it being respected? Is it being listened to? I would highly doubt it. I mean, just history tells me that, and what's happening tells me that our ancestral ways are not being appreciated or respected or upheld.
Right. And my apologies to our audience. We may not get to all the questions. We'll try to get as many questions in as time allows. So thank you for your patience with us. One more question. Are there members of your tribe, people, that are engaged in certain technologies to preserve the language?
Yeah. So my nation in particular, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so we did not have access to this. And I get a little salty over it because your language is part of your culture. Your language reflects your values as a people. And so, yeah, I am upset that I don't know my language and I'm trying to learn it. And it's really hard at my age to learn it. And it's a hard language anyway to learn. But they have classes. So they offer classes. I do not like social media. I made a comment about that, and I apologize to those who do. The only reason I'm on it is because on Instagram, my nation is on there and I follow them, and they do like a word of the day or a phrase of the day. So that's one way. YouTube, the guy that I'm learning part of the language from is on YouTube. There's a woman who goes on YouTube and will just say certain phrases that you can learn. It's so important because I've always said to people, I don't break up. Like when I leave a job, I'm like, I don't break up, I don't say bye. I've always said that. And then when I was learning my language, I found out there's not a word for goodbye in Cherokee. The word means until we meet again. Like doagahovi means until we meet again. So that's like, so I was like that, I picked it up from my culture, but I didn't have the word or the understanding of why that's the way I am, because the language was taken. So yeah, and there's other tribes are doing the same thing, having online classes, using, simple things like YouTube and Instagram.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. And we try to get one more question in. And the question reads, how would I find out what tribe someone was from? Oh, I'm sorry. The question is posing, how would I find out the tribe of origin for my mother after she passed away? The person posing the question is saying that the mom was Taino.
Okay, so this is an interesting thing. There's really, the federally recognized nations a lot of them tend to have what we call rolls. And your ancestors had to sign the rolls before they closed. I will talk more about this in February. So my ancestors signed the rolls. There are Native people who their ancestors didn't for different reasons, you know, namely because it was from the United States government and they didn't want anything to do with the United States government. So they are Native. A lot of them grew up in Native culture, but they're not enrolled in their tribe. So without any kind of knowledge, if you have the name of a tribe, you can contact the tribe to see if their ancestors signed the rolls. And they closed at different times. Ours closed in 1907 in Oklahoma, but rolls close at different times. That's one pathway to do it. The other thing, and it also makes it hard because we relay our history orally, right? Like you may not find a lot of things written down because it is orally passed on. So you would need to look through her things to see if you can find anything that references her tribe, any kind of cultural practice, anything like that. It's not a great answer, and I apologize, but it is the answer.
Appreciate you, Sam, for just helping in the ways that you can. And we are thankful for everyone for joining our Learning Cafe, our question and answer segment. We hope that this will inspire you. We hope that you learn something new and it will motivate you to intentionally have more conversations, have more discussions. This session, and Sam will be joining us next month to give you further information on history and perspective from the Cherokee Nation. Let this inspire you to have conversations with those that may belong to different tribes and different national communities. Just let it be inundated in all your conversations and have more of an investigatory perspective where you ask questions as opposed to making statements. So we thank you for joining us today. There's a link in the chat. Please open up our feedback and our evaluation link so that we can get your feedback for our learning cafes. As the former director who we miss, Fannie Glover always says, your time is currency, and we are certainly happy and appreciative of you spending that currency with us and helping us to grow more valuable so that we can reflect that to you. And without further ado, I'd like to say thank you to you, Sam, and that everyone will enjoy their evening until next time for ECLC's Learning Cafe.